All right, guys. This is going to be a video on the elements and principles. So this is normally what I would be talking about with you in class. So I'm just pre-recording the lecture so that you guys can kind of watch it on your own. But in Google Classroom, um, if you look at the top in resources, there is a section called Elements and Principles Definitions, and you'll find this sheet in here so that you guys can look at this at any time. Um, the big reason I like to talk through it with you is just to give you a better understanding of what these terms mean. Now, it's really important that you guys um, begin to understand these terms because you're going to be using these all semester. And what I'm prepping for you now is you're going to be doing your first write-up, basically, or it's called a four-step critique model. It's also called a self-assessment. Basically, there's a little writing piece you're going to do at the end of each project. The first project you're going to be writing about is your Zentangle project. So I want to go through the definitions with you just so you can hear it come from me and you can kind of get my explanation of it to hopefully help you better understand the words. Also, you can go back to this video at any time and watch this if you feel like my explanation is a little bit better than maybe what's written on the sheet. So I'm going to go through all the terms with you, and then we're going to go through a little bit of an example of what the write-up looks like and how to do that. And I'm going to have an example Zentangle that we'll go through together. Okay. So the first part we have are the elements of design. And remember, these words are also important because this is like our art standard. This is what you guys need to learn as you go through this art class, and it's our key vocabulary. Okay. Now, what the elements are, um, I would consider the elements to be like all of the little tools or all of the little pieces that make up an artwork. Okay. So when you're looking at an artwork, things like line, color, value, they don't necessarily make up the entire artwork, but you can pick pieces of those things out. So all the elements will come together to create the artwork. So I can look at an artwork and I can pick out different lines. I can see where there might be different shapes and things like that. But none of these necessarily would always encompass the entire artwork. They're all the little pieces and parts that make up an artwork. Okay. Now, these words, the elements, you guys are a little bit more familiar with these. So I'll probably go through these a little bit quicker, but you might not know some of the specific definitions of these. So basically, a line, you guys all know what a line is. What you want to think about with a line, though, is that a line is basically just a point or a dot that extends through space. So when you take your pencil and you make a dot and then your pencil begins to move, the moment you move and you make that more than a dot, it now becomes a line. Okay. When you're thinking about line in an artwork, you want to think about what the line quality is and how would you describe the line. So are the lines thick? Are they thin? Are they curvy? Are they straight? Different lines can say a lot of different things, represent a lot of different things depending on how you use them. And that's what I'm hoping you'll see when you do your Zentangle assignment. Okay. Then we have shape and form. The reason why we link shape and form together is because they're extremely similar. Shape and form are basically the same thing, except shape is 2D. So that's the key here. Shape is two-dimensional. So shapes are things like squares, circles, rectangles. They could also just be any random, like a blob shape could be like a shape. Okay, the technical definition of a shape, it's literally an enclosed line. So if you start with this dot that extends through space, that dot then drags out and becomes a line. If that line were to come back and touch itself, it then becomes a shape. Okay. Um, a form is basically the same thing as a shape, but it's 3D. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do just a quick little, I'm going to go to the Canvas thing really quick. And by the way, this Canvas app is here at any time for you guys to use. So let me just hop into this just because I want to be able to just draw on here for you really quick. So like I said, I'm just going to grab this pencil tool here. So here's my dot. And as that dot moves, it now becomes a line. If that line were to ever come back and touch itself, it then becomes a shape. Okay. So something I want to show you is let's just look at a basic shape that you guys know. And I'm going to just switch here and make this a little bit darker. We'll go to like the pen tool. All right. So let's say I have a square. It's a shape you guys all know, right? Okay. So that's an enclosed line. That's just a basic shape. Um, Now to make it a form, if it becomes three-dimensional, it becomes a form. So if we make this 3D, and we do something like this, now it becomes a cube, and a cube is then a form, okay? And forms have their own unique names. So like a circle would be the shape, The 3D form of a circle would be a sphere. Okay, thinking of that. Triangle would be a shape. Pyramid would be a form. So just the whole idea that shape and form are basically the same thing. It's just form is 3D, shape is 2D. So just remember that. So I just wanted to go there to kind of do that. And then the big thing with shapes and forms is that they can be geometric or organic. So going back to this, your geometric shapes are all those basic shapes. So like your circles, squares, triangles, pretty much like shapes that are used in math. Shapes that have names, like even trapezoids, hexagons, parallelograms, those are all geometric. Okay. Organic shapes are basically any shape that doesn't have a standard name. So if I make like a shape like this, that would be organic. If you made a shape that were, it looked like a cat's head or something, like even technically like a heart, I would say is more of an organic shape, even though it's a shape that we have a name to, it's technically not geometric. But yeah, pretty much anything that isn't like your standard mathematical shapes would be considered organic. So when you're writing about shape in an artwork, you could directly tell me what kind of shapes you have, but you could also say, yeah, I have a lot of organic shapes or I have a lot of geometric shapes. So just think about shape that way. Okay. Color, you guys are all familiar with what color is. But what you might not know is how color is actually created. And the way color is created, it's basically light reflecting off of a surface. Okay, and the way I always get people to understand this is, if you're in my classroom and the lights are on and you look at me, I would say, well, what do you see? And most people would say if they're looking at me that they see me, they see the teacher, right? And you can see the desks around you, and you see the chairs. But then if I turn off all of the lights and the room is completely pitch black, what do you see then? And people would say, well, I see nothing, or I just see blackness, right? So the key here to vision is light. Okay. And in reality, our eyes don't see people. We don't see chairs. We don't see desks. We don't actually see any of those things. What we see is we see light bouncing off of those things, and the way that the light bounces off and the amount of light we receive, that that's what determines what colors we see, and it helps us define those shapes and define those objects. So in reality, color is really comes from light. And so another thing that you can think about is if it's like a really hot summer day, um, I will usually ask the class, what kind of t-shirt would you usually wear, a black or a white t-shirt? And people will say, well, on a hot summer day, you usually wear white. And the reason we wear white is because it's cooler, and it's cooler because white reflects more white. And so you're not getting as much of the heat from the sun because you're reflecting that. Whereas people say black is very hot, it's very warm to wear in the summer. And the reason why is black absorbs the most light, it reflects the least amount of light. And so we absorb that light, we absorb the heat from the sun, and that's why black clothes are hotter. So if you didn't know that, that's a nice little tidbit for you guys to know there. So color, the really unique thing is that, yeah, it comes from how light reflects off of a surface, and light is how our eyes see. Okay. Value. So value is one that sometimes people get a little tripped up with. Value in this sense isn't like how much money you think your artwork is worth. When we hear value, we usually think of money, right? But in the art world, value refers to the lightness or darkness of a color. It doesn't even necessarily need to be a color. It could be like a pure light or pure darkness, right? It's also referred to as tints and shades. Okay. So value is how light or dark something is. So like if I took my pencil, we'll leave this up here. So if I take my pencil, right, and I want to color this side in really dark, you could just color this in. And basically, if you're using a pencil, the more pressure you put, the darker it's going to get. And you can see if I overlap, it's going to get darker and darker and darker. If you press lighter with a pencil, you will get lighter values. So now I could go down here and maybe go a little bit lighter. This one, and then maybe I want to go a little bit lighter on this side here. Okay, just to kind of illustrate that for you. Okay, in Zentangle, value, and I talked about this already, basically it's just wherever you can make lighter or darker areas, and it's based on how many lines you use. So if you use more lines, it's going to be darker. If you use less lines, it's going to be lighter. Okay, if you're painting, right, and let's say you have red, if you add white to a color, and white, by the way, would be a tint. So tinting something is adding white. So if you add white to red, you get like a pinkish color, and it's actually like a lighter red. If you add black to a color, that's how you do shades. And adding black will make a darker version of the color. So basically, anytime you're making something lighter or darker, you're using value. Okay. Don't get confused by like lighter and darker colors. So like somebody will take like a base blue, like right out of the bottle, and a base yellow right out of the bottle. And they'll say that the blue is a darker value than the yellow. Well, that's not necessarily true because you could add white or black to each of those. I could make a darker value of yellow and a lighter value of blue. So you think of those, think of like a straight out of the bottle yellow and blue is just kind of like your medium value, and then you can make lighter and darker values of each of those colors. Okay. All right, texture is the way something feels or the way that it makes you feel like, or like you get the illusion that it feels a certain way. So in a drawing, um, you could physically touch the paper and you could feel the texture of the paper, or you could draw something in a way that it might look very bumpy or very rough or very smooth. And in Zentangle, you get a lot of that because of the lines you use. We would call this implied texture. So you can have real texture and you can have implied texture. So real texture is that you can physically touch the artwork and feel how it feels. Implied texture means you draw or create something in a way that it looks like it has a texture, even though it doesn't really feel that way. Okay. And then space. Space is the illusion of distance on a flat surface. So when we draw something 3D, like how I drew this box, this canvas is actually flat. My computer screen is flat, but I can draw this in a way that it looks 3D. So this actually has space to it. Okay. The other way you can have space is you can look at positive space and negative space. So if I were to just look at the simple cube that I drew, the cube itself would be the positive space, and all this air around it would be like the negative space. If this had a hole in it, that hole would be negative space. The object would be the positive space. So even if you have an artwork that isn't 3D, if it doesn't show distance, you can still show space through positive and negative space. Okay. All right, so that's it for the elements. So remember the elements, they're all the little pieces and parts that make up an artwork. What the principles are when all of those elements come together and we're looking at the entire artwork, the principles are basically effects that the entire artwork can have. Okay, so the first principle is balance. And when we're looking at balance, we're talking about visual balance. So that means any good artwork, you should visually want to look at the whole artwork fairly equally. Okay. Um, and there's two types of balance. There's symmetrical and asymmetrical, also known as formal and informal. Um, Symmetrical just means that the image is exactly the same on both sides. So if I go back to here, and let me just like, I don't know, erase this out of here. Maybe can I make this a little bit bigger? Yes, I can. Okay, so let's just erase this out of here. Okay, so just as an example, just to demonstrate symmetrical and asymmetrical and demonstrate balance a little bit here. Let me just grab this pencil. All right, so let's say, well, I gotta go a lot darker so you guys can see that. No. All right, so let's say this is my piece of paper here. Okay. So if you created an artwork where it was exactly, and this is a super simple example, but let's say I create an artwork like this, and I have two objects on each side of each other equally. This would be symmetrical. Basically, if you were to like fold this in half, you would have basically the same thing on both sides. That's what formal balance or symmetrical is. Okay. Asymmetrical would be like any artwork where you're just drawing or creating something and it's just it looks balanced because you have something everywhere, but it wouldn't be exactly the same if you folded it. So if this were my artwork, my composition, and this is how I laid out my objects, um, this now would be asymmetrical balance. And probably 90% of the time, 99% of the time, your artworks are going to be asymmetrical balance. That's the most common, right? Now, when you're looking at visual balance, you could create an artwork that's unbalanced, and that would be bad. You typically always want your artwork to be balanced. So if I created an artwork and I just drew an object up in the corner and the rest of the artwork were blank, this wouldn't be a very balanced artwork. My eye is only drawn to this spot here. It's not really drawn anywhere else. So you need to make sure that if I put something up in this corner, now I maybe put something in this corner to counterbalance it. And then maybe I want to put something up here, and then maybe I do something down here that's maybe a little bit different or whatever. But you kind of want to counterbalance things so that there's something nice to look at everywhere. And like on your Zentangle, that's one reason you're filling out the whole page. But then also, you need to look more specifically at like your lighter and darker areas. If one area is really, really dark, maybe put a dark area on the opposite side to counterbalance that a little bit and kind of balance out your dark areas, balance out your light areas. So visually, that's what balance is all about. Okay. Unity is probably one of the trickier ones. basically what unity is it means that the whole artwork, everything kind of feels like it belongs together. And it's usually because there's something repeating or there's like a theme or something like that. So if we look at Zentangle, and I just have one pulled up here on the side, um, we could say that this has unity because it has all of these repeating ribbons kind of flowing throughout the background. It has unity because it's all black and white. There's no color. It's all kind of got a theme that way. I could also say it has a theme of like specific characters and imagery from an anime that I put in this one. Okay, things like that. So that's kind of what unity would be there. Okay, just basically any way that you can explain why it all looks good together and how does it all look good together? What did you do with the elements, or how are the elements working together to make it kind of flow? Variety, this is one of the easier ones usually to write about. It just means that you have a variety of elements to add interest. So if we look specifically at line, and we'll go back to this, um, I could say I have a variety of line because I didn't use just one kind of line. So you can say there are some straight lines, there's some curved lines, there's some skinnier ones, some thicker ones. Um, there's a variety of different line types throughout this artwork. Okay. If you're looking at other artworks, you could say maybe there's a variety of different colors, maybe a variety of values. Um, variety of textures. What you're going to find when you're writing about principles is that typically you're going to be using an element in your answer. The principles come from elements, right? So, like balance, how did you balance it? Well, I put a certain number of lines on this side and I balanced it with more line on the other side, or I balanced my color on this side with some other color on that side. Okay, unity. Um, the lines and colors are working together because I have a color scheme, and that color scheme gives it unity, things like that. Or I placed my shapes in a pattern that kind of makes it look like it all flows together, something like that. So just keep in mind that all of these, they're all going to come from elements. So when you're writing about these on your artwork, you're probably going to be using elements in your answer. Okay. Movement is if something is actually moving or looks like it's moving. So um, this is kind of like texture in that there can be realistic movement and there can be implied movement. So remember when I talked about texture, there could be real texture or implied texture. Movement, most of the time, it's going to be implied. So if we looked at this, my physical artwork isn't actually moving, right? But you could make sculptures that are kinetic sculptures that actually move. But for most 2D work, they're not actually going to move, right? So you're going to get implied movement. So I could say the way that the ribbons are flowing gives me a sense of movement, like my eye moves along the lines, right? This character is set up in a very action oriented pose, so I get a sense of movement. I can imagine that that character is darting forward. Okay, things like that. So anything that gives you a sense of movement, like the cloud looks like it's kind of flying through the air, something like that. Anytime that you can describe or explain a sense of movement you're getting from the artwork, then that means your artwork has movement. Okay. Rhythm, this one's pretty easy. This is just when elements repeat or create a pattern. So you could go back to this one and say, yep, there's a pattern of lines repeating, like all these lines are shooting up in the same direction. There's a pattern of repeating the ribbons over and over again. I've repeated these cloud textures here. These circles are kind of repeating here and here. The corners have this kind of design repeating. There's a checkerboard pattern here. There's a circle pattern. Zentangle, just so you know, is going to be flooded with rhythm. There's going to be pattern everywhere. So basically, anywhere you can describe patterns or things that repeat, you're good to go. Emphasis, not every artwork will have strong emphasis. It's going to depend. But emphasis is if you make something stand out, make it the central focus point through using elements. So one way to think about it is if you have an artwork and you make something really large and in the middle, it's going to have emphasis because it's really big and it's in the center. If you do a black and white artwork and you make one little part of it color, that color area is going to have emphasis because it's the only thing that has color. If you make something rare, it's going to have emphasis. Okay. So there are different ways you can do it. So if we go back to this one, we can say that there's probably a lot of emphasis here on the middle because it's in the center and because there's a large white area here, whereas the rest of the artwork is fairly filled out. So this was intentional to make the character stand out, and there's a lot of dark lines around the character to make that character really pop out. So depending on your artwork, you may like Zentangle can be really hit or miss. Like if you just do a really balanced Zentangle with lines everywhere, you're probably not going to have one specific emphasis point. But depending on how you design it, you may or may not have emphasis there on that project. But every project's going to be different. Okay, so that's my base explanation of the terms and definitions. Now, I just want to show you really quick what's going to happen. So starting the week that you're watching this video, it should be week 4. I have us kind of looking at the elements and principles and finishing your Zentangle. Whenever you finish a project, okay, you're going to go into the folder here. So it says Zentangle assignment, right? What you're going to do is if you're turning it in, so I'm going to click, we'll go in like this. So in the upper right, you'll see something that says add or create. If you're at home and you're turning this in digitally, you'd want to take a photo of it, click add or create and attach it on here first. If you're going to be back in school at the end of the 2 weeks, you can probably just wait and physically bring it in and that would be fine. I'm going to kind of go slow and like not mark stuff as missing in Skyward during this 2 week period just because I know a lot of you are probably just going to wait till you come back to turn stuff in. But my hope is that you kind of are catching up and you're working on stuff at home during this time. Okay. But the big thing is when you turn in an artwork, you also need to fill out this self-assessment. And here's the 4-step critique model. And one of these Google Forms will always be attached to any major project assignment. So if you see the Google form here, you need to fill it in. And basically the project is worth 70 points. 50 points is the actual project itself, and then this writing is 20 points. So this is something you do want to take seriously, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up, and I'm going to see if I can do like a half screen here so that you can kind of see the artwork we're looking at, and we'll kind of just go through one as an example. So you'd put your name and hour at the top, and you tell me what project you're writing about. So for this one, I would type in Zentangle, okay? Then it says, what was the objective of the project? Now, the objective is written on my whiteboard in the classroom, and it's also in the instructions on Google Classroom. So whether you're digital or in person, you have a way to see that. Basically, the objective is what is the point of the project? So for this one, the objective was to create a detailed artwork using line. So line was really our focus here, right? Then it says describe. Take a visual inventory. What do you see? So you're literally just describing what you see. So for my example, I could say it's a Zentangle pattern with a lot of abstract designs, but then there's also some specific anime characters represented, some clouds, and some other objects from that show. So I would literally just write that out as a sentence. Okay. You're literally just, if you're talking to someone on the phone that can't see it, how would you describe it to them? That's pretty much what you would write there. Okay. Then I want to know what is the type of art. So it can either be realistic, non-objective, or abstract. So realistic means that it looks like how it would look in real life. Non-objective means it's basically non-representational. And I talked about this in class a little bit for my in-class students. But basically, if you look at the artwork and there's no recognizable objects, which very well could happen on Zentangle, right? It could be fully non-representational, then you'd mark that. Abstract means that you can pick out some things, like you can tell there are objects in it, but it's maybe different than reality. So for this example, I would probably pick abstract because I can see objects that I recognize, but it's definitely changed from how it would actually look on the TV show that I would be watching, right? And there's definitely some abstract things going on in the background that are a little bit less representational. So for this example, I would pick abstract. I would say on your Zentangle, if you cannot pick out any objects and it's just a series of lines, and patterns, I would put non-objective. But if you specifically like drew a character or drew symbols in there, then I would say abstract. Okay. The purpose of the art. You're either going to choose aesthetic, didactic, or utilitarian. Okay. Aesthetic is what most of you will pick for most projects. That means art for beauty. So that means you just made it to be an artwork. So the purpose of it would be that you would just hang it up on your wall or you would just look at it because it was meant to be an artwork. But if you think your artwork is informative or useful in some way, you could mark that. So maybe you created an artwork as a poster to advertise something, or maybe your artwork depicts a scene of something that happened in real life or from history. Okay. Um, for example, last year, unfortunately, when Kobe Bryant passed away, I had a student do a Zentangle about Kobe Bryant and it represented his life. So they could say that that artwork is maybe a little bit more informative because it was talking about a real person in real life. So depending on what your Zentangle is, you can think about what you would want to mark. But I would say when in doubt, it's probably aesthetic. You're just making it to be an artwork. Okay. Then we get into the elements and principles. So we're starting with this chapter. And so the reason we call it a 4-step critique model is it has 4 parts. And this whole first page we're doing is called describe. Then there's going to be an analyze part, which is part 2, interpret, and judge. Now, don't get overwhelmed because you can see I'm kind of done a little bit already, but this first page is the longest, and then the other ones get much shorter as we go through. So don't worry, it's not going to be crazy long. Okay. So the describe part, you need to select 3 elements of design that you think your artwork uses. Now, most artworks are going to use almost all of these, but you want to pick the 3 that were the strongest. So for your Zentangle, I would for sure pick line because that was one of the focuses, right? And what you'll notice on my whiteboard and then also in the project description where I have the objective, right below that, I should be writing focus elements and principles. If you literally want to select those for this, that's probably not a bad idea because that project is typically going to use those elements and principles more, but you could pick whatever ones you want. You don't have to pick the focus ones that I write down. But on this one, I think the focus ones I had were line, texture, and I want to say value. Okay. This one, if it's completely black and white, you do not want to pick color. Technically, we'll get into this more later, but black and white technically aren't colors. Black and white are basically like pure tints and shades. We call them colors a lot, and even I do it too. But technically, like when we're talking about color, it's got to have an actual like hue to it. It's got to be like something from the color wheel, and we'll talk about that later when we get to the color wheel. Okay. Um, this one I would say does have space because I could say there's like these white areas could be like a negative space and the darker areas could be a positive space. Shape and form, I could say that, yep, there's circles, there's a lot of organic shapes, there's some couple of geometric shapes. I'd say the circles are mainly the geometric shapes. Okay, but it's mostly organic shapes. Okay. Color though, I would say I do not have color. So that's the only one that would be like an incorrect choice for this, but everything else is fine. Okay. Now, after you select your elements, then what you need to do is you need to write about them. And I'm going to actually type in here a little bit to explain what I want. So I chose line, texture, and value. So you have to write in the ones that you chose. So what you would do is you would type in line, put a dash, and then what I might do is enter down, texture, put a dash, and then value. Okay. So what I would do is I would start by typing the 3 elements that you used, and then I want you to describe how you use them and what they look like in your artwork. Okay. So for line, you want to think of things like, do you have, like thick, thin, you might have some long, some short lines, whatever, but you'd want to actually think of words to describe line and then explain where they are in the artwork. So I'm not going to type it all out, but like I would say on this Fox character, there's a lot more line closely together, a lot smaller lines to create darker values. I might say I have some long curvier lines in the background. Okay, in the corners, I can say I have some straight lines. Okay, those are the types of things you could say. Texture, you want to think of things like, is it rough, smooth, sharp, soft? Like just think of words to describe different textures. Those are the types of things you want to use. So what I would say in here is that to me, all of the like kind of ribbon textures inside the fox character here to me reminds me of actual fur. So I could say that that kind of looks like a fur texture to me. I think the ribbons look very soft in the background. I think some of these sharp diagonal lines, look like rougher or sharper, like blades. Okay, those are the types of things you'd want to say. Value, it's basically where things are lighter or darker. So talk about dark and light areas, basically, is what you'd want to talk about. So right here, these are just like notes I'm typing. You would type in more of what I'm saying, right? Like you're typing out more complete sentences. So what you would say or what you would type in is you would say, I put more lines on the fox to create a darker area. I didn't put any lines inside the character to make him stand out and have a very light value. So say I have very light values where there are no lines on the character, very dark values on the fox, something like that. Okay. Then we're on the analyze part. So this is part 2. Basically, now we're going to choose 3 principles that we think we used. So on this one, I'm going to say variety because I think I have a variety of different lines going on. I'm going to say unity. Um, I mean, rhythm is a huge one. Like, honestly, on this artwork literally has all of these. Okay. So you do the same thing down here. So you would type variety, put a dash, unity, put a dash, and then rhythm. Okay, so you do something like that. And then basically what you need to do here is you need to explain how your artwork has that. So what I'll do is I'll actually go through all of these really quick, but just know that you would type in here for just the 3 that you have. So balance, remember we talked about symmetrical and asymmetrical? We would just say this has asymmetrical balance. Literally, that's all I need to say, and I'm good to go, as long as I correctly state that. Okay. Variety means that we have a variety of different elements going on. So I could say I have a variety of different lines here. So I have really thick lines in the corners. I have really thin lines on the inside of the fox. I have curvy lines, things like that. So basically, you can just say I used a variety of different lines. That could be the sentence that you say. Okay. Unity, how it all belongs together. So I can say because I'm repeating the curved ribbon patterns, because it's all black and white. I could say because it all fits the anime theme, that it has unity. Okay. Movement, I talked about this earlier. The character looks like they're moving. The lines, your eye follows the lines, so you can get a sense of movement. I feel like the clouds are floating around, things like that. Rhythm is pattern and repetition. So I think I said this earlier. Ribbon patterns all around, circle patterns, lines repeating, all of that stuff. And then emphasis, I said the character is the emphasis because they're white and then surrounded by a lot of dark, so it makes them pop out, and they're in the middle. Okay. So what you do is for the three, you would just type your explanation of why your artwork has that or how you created that. Okay. Then the third part, interpret. So all I want you to do for this is basically tell me what the artwork means to you, what it could mean to somebody else, if you get any moods or emotions from it, things like that. Okay. So I just want a minimum of 3 statements. So in here I say answer at least 3 of the following questions. So you could answer like a question more than once if there's a different response. So for example, the question, is it symbolic? Maybe it symbolizes more than one thing. You could make 2 statements about symbolic. The main thing I'm looking for here is 3 statements, right? So for me, I could say this symbolizes an anime that I like. That's 1 statement. Okay. I could say the ribbons in the background remind me of wind. That's 2 statements. Okay. And then the third statement, it makes me think that there's a lot of action. Like the mood I get is I feel like there's action there because of the movement. Okay. 3 statements. So I literally just said 3 things about what it could mean, what it could represent. Even if I don't see something, I could imagine what someone else might see in it. Maybe there's someone looking at this that they don't watch anime, they have no idea what it is, but they really like the fox. It might remind them of The Fox and the Hound, like a Disney movie, right? Or it might remind them of hunting or nature or something like that. So there are so many things an artwork can say. So let's say your Zentangle is completely non-representational, right? Like you don't have the fox, you just have the lines. Notice I talked about how the ribbons remind me of wind or waves. So look specifically at your textures. What does each little area remind me of? The checkerboard reminds me of playing chess. Okay, these little circles make me think of bubbles. Um, this pattern here reminds me of like a Christmas sweater. Like those are all like this here looks like little mountains, right? So like those are all separate statements that you could fill in for this. So it's pretty basic. Okay. Then we have the judge part. On the judge part, this is part 4 of the 4-step model. All I want you to do for this is tell me something that was successful, something you like about the artwork, and I want you to use at least one element and one principle in your answer. So don't just say the artwork is cool, I really like it. What I want you to say is, I really like the way that my lines create a fur texture on my fox here. So I used line and texture. So that's 1 statement, and that used an element. Now I need another statement that uses at least a principle. So I might say, I really like the way my ribbons create movement in the background. So movement is a principle. So if you make 1 or 2 statements here, as long as there's one element and one principle in your answer, then you're going to get the points for that. Okay. And then the reflect part, basically, if you could do something differently the next time you do it, what would you want to improve? Just make a statement on what you would want to do better. So you might say, this area in the lower right looks a little bit light. I wish I would have maybe put some more lines in there, something like that. Okay, so that's basically it. That's the video on elements and principles. And the expectation is you fill out this form at the end of your projects. Okay.